Blaise Pascal was a French mathematical prodigy who was born in 1623 and died at the age of 39 in Paris. He published a paper on conic sections at the age of 16, and it included a famous theorem that is known today as Pascal's theorem. At the age of 19, he invented a mechanical calculator to help his father, who was a tax collector. Now, before he died, he was working on a defense of Christianity, and his notes were compiled and published in 1770 after he died, and they contained a famous defense of believing in God. This defense is known as Pascal's wager. Before I present Pascal's wager to you, I want to note two things. So first, it is quite different from the proofs of the existence of God that we've been looking at before. So unlike the proofs of St. Anselm and St. Thomas Aquinas, Pascal's argument is not a proof that God exists. Instead, it's an argument, at least it's often understood, as an argument that we ought to believe that God exists. Now, a better way of understanding Pascal's wager is that it contains three distinct arguments that build upon one another. And in presenting these arguments, what I'm going to be following are conventions used in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article about Pascal's wager. So that's the first thing. Second, Pascal's assuming that we can choose to believe in God, but he's not assuming that we can just clap our hands or snap our fingers and instantly believe that God exists. Instead, the claim is that there are activities that we can engage in that will result eventually in our believing in God. And these are going to include things like going to church, abstaining from sin, and participating in religious rituals. So Pascal's first argument is called the argument from superdominance. Imagine that you wake up in a room and someone is sitting at a table with a coin. She looks at you and she says, heads or tails? You ask if you can examine the coin and you find that it's a fair coin. So there's a 50% probability that it'll come up heads and a 50% probability that it'll come up tails. How should you decide what to do? Well, if it were me, I would want to ask what happens if I get it right and what happens if I get it wrong. So suppose you ask her, and this is what she says. If you call heads and it lands heads, then you will get $1 million. If you call heads and it lands tails, you don't get anything. If you call tails and it lands heads, I will steal $1 million from you. And if you call tails and it lands tails, you get nothing. Seems like a no-brainer. You should call heads. If it lands heads, then you get $1 million as opposed to losing $1 million. And if it lands tails, then you will get nothing, which is what you would have gotten if you had picked tails. So Pascal thinks that this coin flip scenario is similar to the one we are in with respect to the existence of God. We have no successful proof that God exists. However, what happens if we guess wrong? Well, if we believe that God exists and God does exist, then we get eternal happiness. If we believe that God exists and God doesn't exist, then we don't really lose anything and we die, there's just nothingness. If we don't believe that God exists and God does exist, then we lose a lot. Not only are we losing out on eternal happiness, but maybe we'll end up in hell. If we don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, then we won't win or lose anything. We just get nothingness after we die. So, as was the case with the coin, we're better off believing in God. If God does exist, then we're much better off believing in God than not believing in God. And if God does not exist, then we're neither better off nor worse off for believing in Him. So no matter what, your best bet is to believe in God. Now, there's two main problems with this first argument. So first of all, unlike a fair coin flip, there's not a 50% chance that God exists. If someone assigns a 0 probability to the existence of God, then there's really no reason for them to bet on God's existence. And the second problem with this argument is that it's incorrect to deny that there are any disadvantages to believing in God. So believing in God in the way that Pascal is recommending involves living a life where one is avoiding sin and you're going to church regularly. Sinning can be a lot of fun. And sometimes I want to wake up and play mandolin all day on a Sunday. It might be the case that we should give up both of those things, but we shouldn't pretend that those sacrifices mean nothing. All right, so let's move on to the second argument. This argument is contained in a short section in Pascal's work, so I'm just going to begin by reciting it to you in full. And it goes like this. Let us see, since there is an equal risk of gain and of loss, if you had only to gain 2 lives instead of 1, you might still wager. But if there were 3 lives to gain, you would have to pay, you would have to play, since you are under the necessity of playing, and you would be imprudent when you are forced to play, not to chance your life to gain 3 at a game where there is an equal risk of loss and gain, but there is an eternity of life and happiness. So here's what that means. Imagine that we're back in the room where you have approached the person at the table who shows you a fair coin and says, heads or tails, you have to play, there's no way out of it. So this time, the stakes are different. If you have $1 in your pocket, like you have $1 in your pocket, right? If you guess right, then you get $2. If you guess wrong, you get $1. You might take that bet. You would be even more likely to take the bet if there were $3 at stake, and you'd be a fool to not take the bet if you could win infinite dollars. Now, in the case of God, you have to take the bet. You have to wager something. You can't get out of it. But what we're wagering are our lives rather than our dollars. You can abstain from sin and devote your life to living in accordance with the consequences of believing in God. So let's assume that there is a 50% chance that God exists. Would you wager your life in the way that I've just described for a chance to live 2 lifetimes in bliss and happiness in heaven? What about for a chance to win 3 lifetimes? And what about infinite lives? Pascal thinks that the answer to this third question is yes, and that's the question that we're being asked to consider when choosing whether or not to believe in God. So let's see how this argument does when we consider the 2 objections raised previously. So first of all, it does better than against the second objection. We're now acknowledging that there can be significant cost to believing in God. But it fails to overcome the first challenge. Like, why assume that there's a 50% chance that God exists? Pascal's third argument is the argument from generalized expectations. So, would you rather have a 50% chance of winning $1 million or a 99% chance of winning $1? Clearly, you'd pick the first one. And the point here is that we should calculate whether to perform an action by, for each potential result of that action, multiplying the probability of the result by the goodness of the result, and then adding all that up. So suppose that God is very unlikely to exist. Let's say that there's only a 0.0001% chance that God exists. To figure out the value of believing in God, we need to multiply the probability that God exists by the goodness of believing in God, if God does exist. And then subtract that from the probability that God does not exist multiplied by the badness of believing that God exists if God does not exist. So the value of believing in God if God exists is infinitely good. The value of believing in God if God does not exist is finitely bad. It may make my life a little bit less fun if I have to believe in God, but it certainly isn't going to make it infinitely bad. So as a result, even if there's an extremely small chance that God exists, and even if it would make my life much worse to believe in God, I ought to believe in God. Thus, at last, we finally have an argument that overcomes both the challenges raised against the first argument. And we can formalize this argument as follows. So, premise 1. Either God exists or God does not exist. And you can either wager for God or wager against God. And the utilities of the relevant possible outcomes are as follows, where F1, F2, and F3 are numbers whose values are not specified beyond the requirement that they be finite. I'm just going to let you take a look at the screen, which has the box in front of you. Are you looking at it? Good. All right. So, that is the first premise of our argument. Our second premise is this. Rationality requires the probability that you assign to God existing to be positive and not infinitesimal. And our next premise, rationality requires you to perform the act of maximum expected utility, when there is one. And here's our first conclusion, rationality requires you to wager for God, and then our second conclusion, you should wager for God. All right, So that's the formal argument. Now, when objecting to Pascal's argument, what I want you to do is focus on this formal presentation of the argument. And what you need to do is identify which of premises 1, 2, or 3 is false and give a reason why it is false. Then think about how Pascal could respond to your objection. If you can come up with a way for Pascal to respond successfully, then your objection has failed. And if you can't, then that's evidence that your objection is a good one. So I'm going to conclude this video by just giving you an example of what that might look like. Suppose you think that you have a proof that God does not exist, such that there is actually a 0 probability that God exists. So perhaps, for example, you think that it is logically impossible for an all-good, all-knowing, and all-powerful being to exist in a world where evil exists, since such a being would either not know how to prevent evil, in which case he's not all-knowing, not be able to prevent not know how to prevent evil, in which case he's not all-knowing, not be able to prevent evil, in which case he's not all-powerful, or choose not to prevent evil, in which case he's not all-good. And this argument is known as the argument for the problem of evil. It's a pretty standard argument. Now, if you are in possession of such a proof, suppose you're convinced by the problem of evil, then you should reject premise 2 on the grounds that rationality requires you to assign a 0 probability that God exists. And you should then think carefully about how Pascal would respond to your proof against the existence of God. There are many theistic responses to the problem of evil. So, for example, I'll just give you one. You might claim that it is inappropriate due to our cognitive limitations as humans to infer that God does not exist from our judgments that some state of affairs is evil. So perhaps we just don't understand why God has allowed those states of affairs to obtain, and we would understand how evil is consistent with the existence of a God that's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent if we were, well, godlike in our cognitive capacities. So your next step is to assess whether the response that you have offered on behalf of Pascal succeeds. And keep in mind that the response doesn't need to prove that God exists. The only thing Pascal needs to do is sow some doubt that he doesn't exist. All he needs to do is show that there is some probability above 0 that he does exist for his argument to go through.